So we just got some new data coming out of Columbia University on exactly how catastrophic the consequences have been for Democrats led by Joe Manchin failing to reinstate the child tax credit payments. So I got a good breakdown here from Columbia University, the Center on Poverty and Social Policy, pointing out that 3.7 million more children were in poverty in January of 2022 without the child tax credit payments. So let's just go ahead and get into some of the details here, and then we'll get to the corrupted ghoul from West Virginia, who is largely responsible or entirely responsible for this failing to be reinstated. So they say the monthly child poverty rate increased from 12% in December to 17% in January of 2022, the highest rate since the end of 2020, and the 5 percentage point 41% increase in poverty represents 3.7 million more children in poverty due to the expiration of the monthly child tax credit payments. And of course, Latino and Black children experience the largest percentage point increases in poverty. And you can see here, I mean, this is just absolutely absurd, right? You break it down by race and category here. White people jumped from 7.5% in poverty to 11%. Black Americans jumped from a 19% poverty rate, so 1 in 5 Black children already living in poverty, even with these payments as a supplement, but that jumped all the way up to now being 25%, and Latino families not far behind them at 24%. So basically, minority communities within the United States largely have a child poverty rate of like 1 in 4 children, just absolutely abysmally terrible in the richest country in the history of the world. But this is exactly what a capitalist system that was built on the foundation of a former slave system is going to result in. Okay, this is why we have the same discrepancies that have existed for decades in this country. And so, I mean, listen, you see the child tax credits had an obvious impact, but even with these child tax credits, I mean, we're talking about an overall rate of 12% poverty in the richest country in the history of the planet. Okay, just complete absurdity that this isn't at zero. Okay, but they continue here with more details saying between July and December of 2021, the Internal Revenue Service paid out 6 months of advanced child tax credit payments worth up to $250 per child age 16 to 17 and up to $300 per child under 6, reaching over 61 million children in over 36 million households. And by December, it was keeping 3.7 million children from poverty and reducing monthly child poverty by 30%. Okay, 30%. A roundup of the available research reveals that while in place, the monthly child tax credit payments buffered family finances amidst the continuing pandemic, increased families' abilities to meet their basic needs, and reduced child poverty and food insufficiency, and importantly here, had no discernible negative effect on parental employment. So in other words, it's just a good fucking policy, okay? All around, you are decreasing child poverty, you are giving parents the ability to, keep their basic necessities functioning in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis where millions of Americans and parents lost their jobs throughout this entire crisis. So you're talking about giving people the ability to maintain the very bare life necessities for themselves and for their families, okay? So objectively good policy here, but if anything, the criticism is that it obviously didn't go far enough because, you can slash child poverty by 30%, and that's an absolutely fantastic thing. But the lesson from that should have been, okay, how do we now make up the rest of the 70%, right? How do we then completely eliminate child poverty? If it was this simple with just a simple child tax credit to reduce child poverty by 30%, and, granted, their methods for calculating poverty are not always perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but if you could cut child poverty by 30% and you see the results of that, maybe your next conclusion would be, okay, let's just go eliminate child poverty by expanding this and making this even more robust and able to reach even more people so that we don't have, 1 in 5 Black children in the United States living in poverty on a good day. I mean, again, this is even with the child tax credits, we're talking about 1 in 5 Black American children living in poverty. So again, the lesson should have been let's expand this, not let's let this expire basically, but that's exactly what ended up happening thanks to, again, the corporate ghoul from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, and he did it for some of the most grotesque and absurd reasons you could possibly imagine, okay? Here from NBC News, they say, Manchin privately raised concerns that parents would use the child tax credit checks on drugs. okay, on drugs. And they say the expanded child tax credit is a key part of the Build Back Better legislation, which Manchin said on Sunday he opposes. So not only did he kill all of the other extremely, desperately needed and also extremely popular provisions that were within the entirety of Build Back Better, but on top of that, when you get specific and go policy by policy, this motherfucker is still like stuck in this Reaganite mindset of like welfare queens, where parents who are using this money, and we're going to get to exactly what they use this money on, but parents who are using this money on the bare necessities, he's using this welfare queen, largely, racially driven mindset that these people are just exploiting this system to go use drugs, I guess, with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. And in fact, the evidence actually shows that they were using this for, again, basic life necessities for themselves, their families, and their children. So here from Forbes, they say families have used these payments primarily to pay for bare necessities. The Census Bureau has collected information about the child tax credit in its Household Pulse survey since the summer of 2021, and people who answered that they had received the advanced CTC payments were asked how they used that money, and answers included food, clothing, rent, mortgages, utilities, childcare, education, and donations, among other items, and they could indicate more than one use for the money, recognizing that people face multiple financial demands, and yet food, clothing, and housing, rent, mortgages, and utilities were by far the most important items. And from July to October of 2021, 60% roughly of the CTC recipients used the money to pay for food and clothing, okay? Not drugs. Food and clothing for themselves and their children. 2 in 5 recipients, roughly 41%, use the money for housing and 37% for school and childcare. And in contrast, only a tiny sliver, roughly 4%, bought recreational goods, think basketballs or fishing rods, with their CTC money, which even if you want to go buy a fucking basketball or a fishing rod for your kid, that should also be fine. That's perfectly fine to use this money on something like that. That would be, contributing towards your child's welfare in many ways. But again, you see overwhelmingly that people who were getting these child tax credit payments were using them on housing, on food, etc., basic life necessities. And this applies even more so when you get specific to West Virginia. So they say the CTC payments have been crucial for families in West Virginia who have been more likely to use the money for food, clothing, and housing than is the case for families in the U.S. as a whole. And they say, for example, almost 2/3, 66%, of CTC recipients in West Virginia use the money for food or clothing from July to October 2021, compared to 59% for the country as a whole, and 48.4% of West Virginia CTC recipients use the money in part or whole for housing, while 41% of the total U.S. did. So in other words, the people around the entire country weren't using this money for drugs. They were using it for their children, as is in the name, the child tax credit. They were actually, believe it or not, radical concept here, parents actually care about caring for their children, and they used it to do so. Okay, so completely perverted and disgusting comments here from Joe Manchin, obviously just trying to drum up any excuse that he possibly can to get rid of these payments. Okay, he's an absolute demon. Not much more else to say about him on that front. But again, he also happens to reside over a state that has the 7th highest child poverty rate in the entire country. So just absolute ghoul shit here. Okay, absolutely no excuse to not support something like this. It is objectively good. It objectively, according to the statistics and the data, people were using this for bare necessities, and also it just so happened to prevent millions and millions of American children from falling back into poverty. So objectively good policy. Obviously, Joe Manchin deserves to get blasted for this, but we had a couple politicians who were coming out and giving their takes on this. None of them that we're about to get to here actually mentioned Joe Manchin by name, which I think is a problem in and of itself. But Bernie Sanders had to say, in January, the child poverty rate increased by 40% in just 1 month, jumping from 12% to 17% as nearly 4 million children slipped into poverty. How did this happen? 50 Republicans and 1 corporate Democrat allowed a $300 a month child tax credit to expire. That is morally obscene. So yes, it definitely is. Bernie, I wish that you would actually say his name instead of using these vague terms. We all know who the fuck you're talking about. It's Joe Manchin. Just say he's corrupt, call him out by name. Again, we had Rashida Tlaib also made a comment on this. She said, "It is beyond revolting how little attention is given to the fact that the wealthiest nation in the history of the world can afford endless wars and trillions in tax cuts to the 1%, but cannot feed, house, or care for its own children." So she's 100% right. Again, I wish they would actually call out Manchin by name, but she's 100% right in this analysis here, because you never hear shit about what defense contractors are going to spend the millions and millions of dollars in contracts that we give to them, right? You never hear about, oh, how are you going to pay for it when it comes to endless endless militarism or handouts to corporate America that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. You never hear that. You never hear how are we going to pay for it, or what about the debt, or what about the deficit from guys like Joe Manchin. You never hear about it unless it's money that is going to working class families and working class Americans. And a perfect example of that was the video that I covered on this channel just a couple days ago of those West Virginia coal miners who were calling out Manchin for opposing the entirety of Build Back Better. But part of that video that I didn't get to at the end of it was them specifically talking about the child tax credit. Okay, I'll link that video down below if you want to go watch it for yourself from More Perfect Union. But they were talking about the child tax credit. Okay, these are West Virginia coal miners, the people who a guy like Manchin loves to pretend to represent, and even they were saying this shit is desperately needed. We need that shit back. Joe Manchin, you have to go support that. So obviously there is local support within West Virginia to get something like this done. If anything, they need it more than arguably almost every other state in the entire country. And on top of that, just to give you a perspective on the cost side of this, extending the child tax credit was roughly, and making it a permanent policy, which is what we should have done. We should have just made it a permanent feature. But to extend it on a yearly basis would cost roughly $100 billion per year. Okay, $100 billion per year. And that comes at the same time that Joe Manchin, or Joe Biden, just asked for a $770 billion minimum defense budget. So you have simultaneously Joe Manchin refusing to call out the corruption in the Pentagon and voting through these massive bloated military budgets unquestionably, okay? And that's multiple times more, almost 10 times more the cost than it would be to take 4 million children out of poverty. I mean, what are our priorities here? Is our priority to just give endless sums of money to defense contractors, or is it to actually help the American people? I mean, that's really the question that's on the table, and I think that anybody who watches my channel understands that question has already been answered to a large degree. But we also had a take here from AOC, who says one U.S. senator, again, call him out by fucking name, but he heard stories about people allegedly using the CTC for drugs without any evidence or data to back it up. He then used that as a justification to nuke the entire national program, causing millions of kids to fall into poverty in weeks. Horrifying. And she also says, meanwhile, the press talks about it like it's some Beltway drama without ever showing the people who are sleeping in bubble jackets with no heat, or the kids going hungry, waiting for some guy in a yacht to decide if they are fully human or not. It's just shameful, all of it. So listen, they're all 100% correct at the end of the day, but the only thing that is going to force Joe Manchin to fall in line on this specific policy is going to be Joe Biden going to West Virginia and completely embarrassing him. Okay, that's the only strategy at this point that will actually work. You need an all-out campaign. You can include guys like Bernie Sanders and representatives like AOC, the rest of them that are calling him out right now. Call him out by name, go on all of the media outlets, go on all of the shows, call him corrupt, and have Joe Biden fly out to West Virginia tomorrow and do a rally where he stands next to West Virginia families who are struggling right now, and he says the only thing standing between you guys and this desperately needed relief here in the child tax credit is your Senator Joe Manchin. And I guarantee you, if he went to West Virginia and he did a rally and he called him out directly by name and made it explicitly clear to the people of West Virginia what Joe Manchin is doing right now, then he would fold in a second. Okay, he is a paper tiger. He is weak at the end of the day. The only thing that is protecting him is the refusal of the Democratic leadership and the refusal of the media to actually call him out as the corrupt motherfucker that he actually is. So at the end of the day, that's the solution. You need a full court press, or I guess millions and millions of Americans are going to continue sitting in poverty thanks to one corrupted senator from West Virginia.